The next time it was dark, so dark, pitch black everywhere, and you swept in so fast. I couldn't make out what was happening, but I could see what the night had done to you. I saw something new. I saw that you only lived there in the night, that it was the only place you could live, but that you also didn't really know how to live there, or maybe anywhere. I saw that you could only succumb to it, never stand up to it. I saw that the night tore you apart and had you convinced that you could not withstand anything real, real like looking at yourself being pulled apart, spilling open, dissolving, tearing. I saw what the night had done to you. I couldn't see anything else, but I could see this. You did not understand that the night is to be resisted sometimes. But how? How could you not understand? I was just a child, you were not. How could you not see? Maybe you were the night. Maybe that's why. And what was wrong with me? I could learn how to hold the night off, but not how to hold you off. You were still growing steadily within me. How? Something can shake up your entire sensorium, throw every way of knowing, feeling, perceiving into crisis. And that is called trauma. But what if each constitutive block of the sensorium is wrong, so wrong, and there isn't shaking up so much as continually permeating bad? How do you get it out? It stayed dark the whole time. You were sweeping through me and through me, wringing me out. I was a piece of broken glass tumbling in the surf. I was being inhaled and exhaled by something. Something. It was dark. It stayed dark. I was so scared for you to see me naked. Soon it was over and you said, "See you in the next world, baby." And I stood silent and motionless, incapable as always, everything spilling out of me.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is outcast, the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion and our guest, we want to mention we've got a Patreon account, patreon.com/MUHH. Taylor needs a new pair of shoes, so let's get a dollar for him. If you can't do that, that's, we totally understand. If you could leave us a nice review on iTunes, that'd be great. To that end, we actually want to shout out a couple of our listeners for leaving a couple of reviews over the past week. And those two are MacGenius09 and Young Don Sutherland. So shout out to both of you for that. Today, Taylor and I are very proud to bring you our guest, Lindsay Lerman. Lindsay earned her PhD in philosophy from the University of Guelph. She is author of 2 novels, I'm From Nowhere and What Are You, and is translator of Francois Laruelle's first book, Phenomenon and Difference, Essays on the Ontology of Rêvasson. You fucked me up there, Taylor. What are you doing?
I did fuck you up. I did fuck you up.
But Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us on this week's edition of the podcast. Excited to chat with you and get to meet you. I know you and Taylor have a pre-existing relationship. So yeah, just welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. This is really fun.
Am I right that the translation is dropping this month?
Later in the month, I don't know the exact date. I think they're still working on the final copy edits, or, I don't really know. But yes, very soon.
I got to give you big congrats, because we were talking about this, 4, 5 years ago, and it was
5 years.
And even 5 years ago, it had been delayed, right? So this is like it's one of those, what do you call it? I was going to say premature birth, but it's the opposite of that. It's a very very mature birth. It took a while.
Yeah. Like, this is not a baby anymore. This is a toddler. If I'm remembering correctly, I think I actually finished the translation 5 years ago. So
okay.
I actually feel so far. I mean, think of everything that's happened in the past 5 years, right? It's like insane. We're all so different in so many ways. I actually feel quite far from the person who translated it. And I'm supposed to go on a podcast to talk about it sometime soon. And I realized, oh shit, like I need some notes, because I don't know what I remember of it. It's just been so
Right.
long since my head was in it. I realized I really got to prepare. Like I got to get immersed back into the world of that book. But yes, the translation is done. I mean, the first iteration of it.
That's awesome. Yeah. So, and since you said that you probably need a refresh, and you're going to be talking about this on another podcast, I won't, bother you about Laura Well. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your background, maybe an anecdote that gives us some of your origin story, whether it be in the humanities, philosophy, becoming a novelist, a writer, even
Yeah.
translating as a part of that
Mhm.
excursus and trajectory?
Well, I don't know if I have any like charming anecdotes, but I do know that I was thinking about this the other day. I don't really have any memories of any time in my life when I wasn't writing.
Okay.
And often as a child, I wrote a lot of stories, and I think I always kept a journal or a diary, but I never used them to like work out how I felt about anything. I think it's just more matter of fact. Like I needed, not even that I needed to narrate my existence. It was just like I didn't know how to process being alive on this earth without having some sort of self reflexive relationship through language. And so, I grew up in a home where, how to say this? It just wasn't particularly emotionally stable.
Okay.
So I think probably I used art, many different forms of art, as like a crutch, a big
Okay.
crutch. As I got older and older, and I found that my relationship with writing just kept developing. It never went
Mhm.
away. My relationship to it got more sophisticated and less
Mhm.
crutch like, you know.
Right.
It grew as I grew and as I changed. And, I wanted to go study creative writing, but that simply wasn't a possibility for me. I went to, for undergrad, I almost did not go to school, but I ended up going to the state school where they were like, hey, you're in the top 10% or something of your graduating class. So you will get in if you apply, and you'll get a partial tuition waiver. And that was it. That was my option. So I took it, and I found philosophy my first semester. I didn't know what I was going to study other than I
Mhm.
thought probably English, but I took a philosophy class and I was completely hooked.
That's awesome.
Completely hooked. It was just like, oh shit, I'm smart. I hadn't really known. I just had not known. I suspected that maybe I wasn't as much of an idiot as I thought I was, but, I just never had. I'd been exposed to all kinds of, I guess you could call it Eastern thought through my father, and
Okay.
Jewish mysticism also through my father and my father's side of the family. So that was in lots of ways very formative, but the systematic study of philosophy and
Right.
of literature, had not realized that was an option for me until I got to school, and I was really, really able to do it, like really able to do it. Like I just flew through those classes and I loved it. I felt so alive, you know?
There is that feeling of I can do this, and
Yeah.
a little bit of philosophy goes a long way because you feel smart, and then you get into more of it, and then you not so much, right? It's kind of, you had that Socratic moment where like, hey, maybe I don't really know anything.
Yes,
But no, that's
absolutely.
did you also study some literary theory? Because that was something that got me into philosophy, being having
Mhm.
that background of kind of as a kid always writing poems or stories or being
Yeah.
interested in literature. When I found out, when I was an undergrad and had this big volume of the Norton anthology of theory and criticism, and they're like, okay, today we're going to be reading Lacan's essay on the mirror stage, and you're going to apply this to Frankenstein. It was very, on the one hand, very hard and very new, but it was also like, holy shit, I can do this with any text. That was a big aha moment where,
Yeah, so exhilarating, right?
yeah, it opens up a lot of doors. So that's wonderful. And so you got a bachelor's as well as a PhD in philosophy, right? Or was there some other?
Yeah, there were other degrees in there too. So I found philosophy. I loved philosophy. I wanted to study philosophy forever, I thought, but I needed to have a job as soon as I was done with undergrad. Like it wasn't really an option for me to just kind of like bum around and keep going to school. I really needed to have a job. Everything in my life made that super clear. Like you need to be able to pay your own bills, all that. So simultaneously, I got an education degree because I thought, well, I can teach. And I don't know why. I mean, I know why I felt called to teach. I felt like this is maybe going to be a bit too cheesy maybe cheesier than I want to be, but I guess I'm feeling honest right now. I felt like if I have one gift in this world, it's that I think I might be able to like open up human hearts a bit. Like there's just something about me,
Yeah.
like people have, since the moment I could listen, people have always given me their deepest, darkest secrets just immediately. Like maybe I'm trustworthy, maybe I don't know, maybe
Mhm.
I'm an evil villain who can draw out things through a sort of false intimacy. But if there's one gift I have, I felt like it's actually touching hearts or opening hearts or something. And it seemed like teaching could be a way to do that and make money and maybe also give something back to the world and not just take and take and take and take. I simultaneously got an education degree and then I went, so I finished my bachelor's in my BA in philosophy and my BS in education. And then I went out and started teaching. And I taught for a few years and that was great, extremely hard, extremely hard and challenging and
Yeah.
demanding, but also wonderful in so many ways. But I knew at a certain point that I was not done with philosophy and that
Right.
it wasn't done with me. So then I went on to get the PhD. And it was while I was doing the PhD that I really leaned in pretty hard to also writing novels on the side that I just did completely in secret because maybe I told a couple of friends, but that's it. Because I had like really my deepest biggest dream was to be a novelist. But I also loved philosophy and I hoped to one day be able to teach philosophy. And so, I nudged myself a bit onto the professional philosopher track, even though deep in my heart, I think I knew I wanted to do something a little more wild.
That's great. And I was going to suggest if you actually were taking the traditional supervillain route, you would have become a psychoanalyst because it sounds like you've got the superpower of inducing transference or something like this, right? That's
Yeah.
kind of,
Mhm.
you're
Yeah, I do.
you're just choosing not to wield that power so directly. And
Well, I can't now at this point in my life. I just think knowing what I know about the world and myself and how cruel people are, like I can't. I just really can't. And over the past few years, I've kept to myself a lot more too. And
Mhm.
part of it is that it's been, things change when you publish books and like you get even just a little bit of attention. Things change and people get weird on you and some people disappear and some people suddenly appear and they want to be your best friend and there's something off. So my relationship to people and to the world has had to shift a bit. And I've realized like if I use that superpower right now, it's not going to go well. It's
Right.
going to
It's
be
like,
bad.
what's the adage about black magic? It comes back sevenfold. If you put evil out into the world,
Yeah.
something like that, right? That's why I think, and I've been encouraging Coop to do this, but that's why I had to get off Facebook because of something like you're talking about, just that constant, immediate ability to interact with people that you may have known or now, and it gets
Yeah.
weird. Twitter's one thing because it's mostly anonymous and mostly shit posting, but I feel like
Yeah, and
Facebook.
more performative. Twitter can be more performative and ridiculous, whereas Facebook
Yeah.
is it's so earnest and like early internet, like family photos and all that stuff, which is fine, whatever, but I don't really want to do that.
The only time I will creep onto Facebook is to see photos of my nieces. So that to me is like the proper use of Facebook because my sister, she's a proud mama. She's going to be putting out photos of her beautiful girls. And so that's kind of
Yeah.
nice. That's not
It
bad.
is.
That's not
No,
bad.
it really is. No, it really is. It's just when you get into a situation where you can sense that people want to use whatever personal information you might have as a kind of ammunition, that's when I just have to disengage completely.
Going into the book, what was interesting was, I guess it was about halfway through or maybe getting close to a third of the way through. And I saw for the first time, you mentioned philosophy, this scene about your stacks of philosophy books, the U is quipping at you, right? That it's self-help mumbo jumbo. I brought this up only because I'm wondering about your decision, because I know later you kind of identify the narrative voice as philosopher, right? Put this failed philosopher on the stage, right? Because of, and again, I could bring more of the context, but I guess I just wanted to figure, and I'm not going to ask a big question like how much of this is your personal life, blah, 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 because you put that at the forefront of the prologue, right? The creativity and lived experience are kind of in this back and forth interchange. But I did want to ask, because you said that you started writing novels in earnest during the philosophy PhD, how much do you feel your writing of these novels, the ones you haven't published or, because I don't know about your unpublished material, but like specifically this book, what do you think about philosophy's relationship to it, not just the influence of your creativity, but perhaps
Yeah.
some of the material that made it in?
The more general answer, I think, is that everything I do is an engagement with philosophy. I mean, everything in my life, whether it's writing novels or even writing poetry or my relationships with people and the world, it's all, none of that can be separated from philosophy. You know, philosophy is in me. The philosophical impulse, the sort of questing energy of life is in me. And, you know, you could think of it as like the very basic Socratic method, right? That's in me. That's how I go about the world. You know, how do I know this? How do I think I know it? Why did I think I know it? You know, just that never ending questioning. That is, to me, that is one of the purposes of life. And so that's in me no matter what I do, whether it's like constructing an argument, an airtight argument in order to do what a capital P philosopher would do, or whether that's writing these stories that require to me a kind of maybe a hyper referentiality, multitextuality. All of that to me is just part of my work as a living philosopher. So that's the more general answer. I think the more specific answer and the reason why philosophy has to show up in this book is that what other kind of book could I really write? You know, I'm working on a more standard novel right now that might not have a single reference to any philosopher or any theory at all in it. It might have absolutely none of that visible anyway. It might be all underneath, under the surface. But I mean, what other kind of book could I write, especially for my second book, if I wanted to really express like who and what I am, even though I do end up having to be, I think, very careful about making sure that people know that the narrator of all of my books is not necessarily me, right? You know, I want to be careful of that or mindful of that, but also, honestly, what other book could I possibly write? You know, someone with my particular background, my particular interests and obsessions and skills and talents, and also lacks and all of that. Like, what else could I possibly have written? And I will say that to me, this book was like, this is a Dark Night of the Soul book. This was a moment, I think, in my development as, I don't want to say an artist, but in general, as someone who strives to create, like with the fabric of my life. You know, this was a moment when I was questioning all of it and everything. Like, what is the fucking point of any of it? You know? And the Dark Night of the Soul moment is, to me, it's essential and it's sacred. And if I wasn't going to be able to do it in this kind of textual way, I feel like I would have been like not fulfilling my purpose on earth or something.
Right. And I do think that's interesting, though, in towards the end of the work, some of, again, perhaps some of my favorite, because it is most overtly theoretical, which that's my bias, I suppose. But you don't attribute this quote, but you do have the quote about, you know, not necessarily separating art and life, and art being this intensification of life and experiment and living, right, as the intensification. So I think that kind of goes back to how you've been discussing this. And I guess that's the interesting thing too, again, more overtly talking about the role of philosophy by section 2, very early on in the book, because I think you only had 2 epigraphs to sections besides the very beginning of the book, before the prologue. You do have a quote from Simone Weil, and you have a quote from Lyotard later, I think, in 17. Yep. So I wanted to ask you about that to get into, so we can leave it behind, I suppose. But I did look up the essay that you quote on human personality, and I thought it was actually very helpful for me to start to get into perhaps one of the ways, obviously not the only way exhaustively, but one of the ways you were using, let's say, this impersonal you and this and then perhaps this impersonal I. Do you want to say maybe a little bit about either one of those things, whether in particular or in general?
I love what she writes about personality and impersonality. That to me is some of her finest work, I think. The issue that I have taken with the way Simone Weil constructs impersonality is that I'm not sure there's enough of a recognition on her part that in order to achieve what she's calling impersonality, you got to go all the way through personality. You can't force it. It's like you can't just tear off the veils. You know, you have to peel them back one by one. I don't know if that's the right metaphor exactly, but you can't just leap straight out of personality into impersonality. And impersonality, I mean, to me, it's this is a pretty mystical concept of hers. I mean, she's really a fundamentally mystical thinker, I think. But the impersonal is, it's like it's a pretty mystical concept. I think you could think about it in terms of Buddhism, maybe. It's this state of being in which I think it's recognized that life on earth is temporary and that there's this sort of unified or unitive source from which we all emerge and to which we will all return. And so it's not just as simple as the body is a shell to house the soul or something like that, but that what happens on earth is this temporary dance of a fundamentally impersonal or indistinguishable source of life, flow and flux, that kind of calcifies and coheres just for a moment. And we tend to call that personality. We really adhere very strongly to this idea that we all have unique personalities, and that really says something important about who we are. I think she's pretty dismissive of that, which I really like and I do agree with, but my gut tells me that we can't just leap straight out of personality.
Right.
We've got to get all the way down to like the disgusting roots of personality. And then we see the impersonal core or something like that. And the impersonality reveals itself. The fact that we do all come from one source and we return to one source, or however you want to think about it. The fact that that is the real reality. That's what I think she's getting at with impersonality. And I think that's the zone I was working in with this book. And that's why I could use names, I could use locations, I could use times, I could use dates, but those had to appear and then dissolve and appear and then dissolve, because if I was cling to them too much or to over-identify with them, I think the book would have been, to me, a failure.
It would be overdetermined or something like this. Yeah, I like that notion of almost like a figure ground relation, right? A figure rises and then dissolves back to the ground. It's interesting too, because you're talking about, if you're going to get to the impersonal, you can't just make a leap of faith or something. You have to work through it. It's almost like we've talked about recently. One of the cautionary warnings that they always bring up in 1,000 Plateaus is don't de-stratify too quickly. You even bring it up about you understand her death, right? That later in the book, you kind of mention you understand something of her death, at 34, basically starving herself to death through this.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to call it a suicidal line of flight, but perhaps it has an aspect of that, of trying to leap into the impersonal without any strata left. That's what happens, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I've thought about her death. I was at the Vase Society a few years ago and I actually gave a paper and I mentioned her death in it, which is kind of a big no-no.
Interesting.
Amongst the Vase scholars, especially the American Vase Society, as it was structured at the time. It was primarily older scholars at the time. I think it's gone through a big shakeup now because there's so much more interest in her work. But at the time, I gave this paper and it was actually about her and Bataille and their friendship, because they had this funny friendship, kind of adversarial, respectful, but then also kind of mean and nasty to each other. I'm fascinated by it. And they would have lunch together and argue. And so, I wrote about how I think some of his work about her is actually this kind of like sad love letter, because he misses her and he's sad that she died so young, and he's like angry that she gave up too fast or something like that.
Right.
And this paper ended up being massively controversial. I thought they would never let me come back and give a paper again, because they were just like, you can't call her an anorexic. You can't say that any of this was suicide. And I think I was speaking of it in much more careful, subtle terms than using terms like anorexia and suicidal, because I also think it is much more complex than that. But I realized, you are just simply not ever supposed to talk about her death, as though her death weren't extremely important in the story of who she is and how she thinks, right?
That seems like it seems like you had a symptomatic kernel there to have brought up something that seems so significant, because I was actually looking at her Wikipedia page the other day. I know that's not like the end all be all, but sometimes the way that even on the Wikipedia page her death is framed, it's very just kind of in passing,
really? Yeah, I haven't looked at that.
It's very seemingly repressed. Instead of there even being like a section on how she died, it's just kind of, mentions offhand in passing, basically, as we mentioned, right? Like eating less and less and having a heart attack. It's just the super added thing that seems not to be significant. And so even on the page, perhaps crafted by one of these scholars, it's, you can tell it's kind of a touchy issue or something that's not supposed to be addressed directly. So
that does come out in this book, I think, for me, that like, the way that, I don't want to say that if she starved herself to death, it was an obsession with purity or moral purity, but
right.
there might be something like that, right? Like part of what happens when someone de-stratifies too quickly is that they just want really badly to want a different kind of thing, like people in spiritual communities, like often they want really badly to be the kind of person who wants to be one with God. They're often not there yet, because if you think you're there, you're not there.
Right.
And so there's some, I don't know, I just have this feeling sometimes, I have this sense when I read her work that, she lived through a lot of stuff that we're now living through, so I feel like when I call on her, I want to be very careful about my use of her. I want to be hyper respectful. All these thinkers, all these musicians, all these sociologists, like every single person I engage in this book, I do it, to me, with the utmost respect, because like so many of them, to me, they gave their lives for the greater cause of asking the impossible questions and living into the answers, whatever answers they could. I want to be careful about how I talk about her life and her death, but I have this sense that like there's a little bit of a purity obsession, and that could be part of what led to the need to say, okay, well then I will starve myself to death in solidarity with the starving people of the world. And there's a part of me that's like, oh yeah, that would be great. Like I would, in some ways, to be so certain that you could achieve a kind of blameless state. Wouldn't that be nice? Like, doesn't that sound just like, oh, okay, I could finally rest. Like I would know I've done the right thing. I'm the right kind of person. I'm doing the good stuff, but it's not that simple.
Yeah. And that does come out through your narrative in many places. So that helps to clarify some of that struggle, that kind of internal struggle that gets verbalized in the work, this, as though we have reached that stage where we can be so self-assured and determined. That's honestly fascinating. And I think that the notion of the impersonal then gave me a lot of ways to go with it, because now it's no longer, as you mentioned, the I is no longer, and obviously in any work of literature, there's that fallacy of identifying the narrator with the author. Yes. But I think that it could be easier to slip into some of that with your work, because you do give obviously some personal details, but that's, as you said, that's just kind of a figure on the ground and perhaps even a lore, when in fact there does seem to be this, what I was thinking kind of again, kind of, Deleuze, Sartre stuff, the impersonal transcendental field or something that's going on, which kind of, again, it resonates with her use of the impersonal, but it is interesting, this question. And I know on the back of the book, it is this question if the you takes on these figures, but is also perhaps addressed to the cosmos. Do you want to say something about that, or was that your blurb, or was that?
I don't think I wrote that.
Okay. So
yeah, I mean, it's really hard when you have a book like this. Bless the people who believed in this book. It's just so hard to figure out how to try to describe it in terms that will make sense to like the largest number of readers possible.
Right. At a glance, right?
Yeah. It's just a really hard job, I think, to take something like this and quickly encapsulate it, which is not to say that I think it's beyond the elevator pitch. I don't think anything is beyond elevator pitch, but like, yeah, I think that, well, the trouble with identity is in the book, and it's in the real world, and it's in the book. To me, the trouble with identity, or identifying anyone or anything, or even causes and effects, all of that, and my relationship with time and how sometimes it slips, all of that, to me, that's my lived experience, and that is in the book. My friend Charlene, I don't know, do you know Charlene Elsby? She's a philosopher and a novelist as well.
I will add her to my list, and you don't have to tell her I don't know her. I don't want to offend anyone, but no,
that's okay. But Charlene, when she wrote about my book in the Los Angeles Review of Books, was like, to me, it was really, it helped me understand what had been going on when I was writing this book, because this is always the case, that when I sit down to write, I don't have a roadmap and I don't really know what I'm doing. And often I'm in a trance state. It's often years later that I can actually finally understand what I was up to. But, Charlene, she wrote essentially that like what I ended up doing in What Are You is forcing the reader to be in a body that understands that consciousness actually cannot be limited by the body or by any conditions, really, ultimately. And so that to me is playing out in this book. And of course, that also plays out in my life. That plays out in everybody's life. That plays out in existence. That's like one of the fundamental realities of existence. We can't really determine the limits of consciousness. And what we end up doing when we tell stories is often we set up sort of artificial limits and boundaries for what consciousness is, or what an identity is, or what a human is, or all of that, right? What a thought is, what an emotion is, what a relationship is. We set up these arbitrary, temporary borders or boundaries or whatever, when really everything is so much more in flux and flow. Yes, on the one hand, there are some sections of the book that you could say they're addressed to particular people or places, but they're also addressed to the larger forces of flow and flux and change that actually can never really be directly addressed.
What I liked about in the prologue, you kind of put this straightforward, although I think it takes a while to be able to ruminate on what it means, where you're kind of bringing up this notion of wanting to pierce the person or the personality and get to the forces. That trope comes back up later in the book, and whether or not that's a possibility or whether or not that's a fool's errand or something like this. But it did make me think. This is kind of why I brought up the impersonal transcendental field, but I was also thinking immediately about my own little bias. I was thinking about pre-individual milieu in terms of that you're trying to get to the forces that subtend and animate the individuation of individuals' personalities, et cetera. And that's something that I think helped to give me at least a little bit of something to look out for along the way. Reading the work is not being seduced by any particular you or I, not falling into that trap of trying to capture by way of identity
right. But then isn't it so fun sometimes, right? Like to me, there's every tension is present in this book. Isn't it so fun sometimes to let yourself be seduced or to be the seducer and to fall for the silly game of identity and
of course,
you know what I mean? To me, the fun, some of the more fun and like kind of wicked moments of this book, we're playing around with that.
It's obviously the non-dupes error, right? Like I wasn't trying to just be like vigilant, but definitely it is part of that. And I guess that gets me to the next point, which is goes to the in the copy you sent me. You said you can happy swimming, and I think that the trope of water swimming particularly comes up throughout the work, and so maybe there's something there about being immersed and submerged in these forces that can overwhelm us, but also swimming to the surface. And as you're kind of mentioning, letting one go with that flow and fall into, I don't want to say, something transcendent like personality, but letting things take on a concrete form for a little while, because you can't just be submerged in the flow. Sometimes you do have to take a breath, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's why a lot of my good friends have always been what I would call like intensity junkies. I think we understand each other. Like there's this desire to just stay immersed in the flow all the time, or, to escape the body or something like that. But, you really can't live a human life and do that. Or, you can, but it's going to be short-lived and you might end up, causing a lot of suffering. And I don't want to do that, In a way, the book is a bit of a wrestling with that. But I was also thinking a lot about, I've always been a swimmer. That's no secret whatsoever. Like I've always been a serious swimmer and I feel often most at home in the water. But I was also thinking about birth a lot because I had a baby, well, 10 years ago now, but some portions of this book have been with me for 10 years. And so I was thinking very much about how we all begin in fluid, we live in fluid. We begin our lives on this planet immersed in water. Well, water and a bunch of other saline and all whatever else we have in us. We begin in the water. And to me, this is fascinating. And I've also been thinking about this book as kind of a metaphor for childbirth because, I think my first book was pregnancy. Like if I was going to give birth to myself as the new version of myself who is, sort of no longer in the closet about being a writer or an artist. The first book was pregnancy, I think. And then the second book was the long, difficult, arduous process of labor and delivery. And this also goes back to Dark Night of the Soul, I promise. So I don't know if you've known any women who've had babies other than your mothers, or, if you've spoken to women who've gone through labor and delivery. But for most women, there's this moment of labor it's called the transition. I'm fairly
Mhm.
certain this is the technical term for it, the transition. And it typically comes after, the many hours of active labor, a lot of contractions, the baby moving down further and further into the birth canal and everything getting set, for the baby to finally emerge. And, it's very challenging, really, really arduous, really difficult. For some women, that can be a multi-day process. But then there is usually this moment called the transition where the mother is like just completely exhausted, like exhausted in a way they've never, ever been before, a whole new level of exhaustion, right? Not just physical exhaustion, emotional exhaustion, psychic exhaustion, all of it. Because not only have you gone through this tremendously challenging 9-month period, now it's this moment of intensity and pain. And what comes out is a baby. And then your life is never, ever the same.
Right.
Literally never, ever the same after that one moment. So typically what happens in the transition moment is that women will say, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm sorry, I'm not doing it. Like, it's not happening. This baby's not coming out.
Right.
It's never going to happen. It's not even really a denial. It's just like, it's extremely common for women at this moment to be like, no, I'm not doing it. It's done. Just like kill us both. It's done. It's not happening. The sort of admitting the stakes are as high as they are often makes it so that the last stage of labor, the actual delivery, can happen and it's fine. But it's like this breakdown moment. And I think of every single birth as having this moment of the dark night of the soul built into the experience of labor, this moment where you like get to the very serious stakes, it's life or death and your life will change. And it's so intense. And then what happens is what happens. But I think that this book was my moment of transition as I was, I guess you could say, giving birth to myself. I feel kind of crazy saying that, but I mean, that's my thinking these days.
I don't think that sounds crazy at all. It's profound. And I do think that there's a moment off the top of my head. I can't remember where it is, so I won't belabor the point. And not to pun, I guess I did.
Pun away.
I know there's a section in the book where there's something like this that's verbalized more concretely. Off the top of my head, I wouldn't know where to put my finger to find it. But I do sense this notion, and I like that you brought all of that in to describe these creations that, I mean, of course, you do talk about, I don't want to say the dialectical complicity of creation and destruction. That's not the part I was thinking of, but there's something to that. Let's just settle for that there is that. I guess you could say that's the dialectical like contradiction at the height of creation. There is this right? There is this before things can move through, and that if that can be thought of as a dark night of the soul, then I think that that's a wonderful way. Because I know that before we started talking, you did want to maybe talk about some of the dark energies that perhaps pervade any work of life, of art, any intensification of life permeating. And sometimes we may not want to focus on those dark energies as much, right? Sometimes there is this desire rather to stick above the surface, above the water, and not, talk about the murky underpinnings.
Yes. I mean, I've always been drawn to the darkness, and metaphorical darkness and the actual darkness. I don't know what it is. I guess I've just never really been afraid of the darkness. And I don't think I've ever feared that I'm going to get lost or stuck in the darkness. I've trusted, and I've trusted more and more throughout my life that I can go to the dark place, really dark places, and there's something to learn there, and like that I don't need to be afraid. Really, it also relates to like my spiritual life and my spiritual growth, which has sort of gone on this journey to study Kabbalah, which is, I guess it's like part of my heritage. My family is Jewish, and it's been a really fascinating thing to begin to study, and I'm really just very much at the beginning. What I love about, I think, any sophisticated system of metaphysics, and I mean metaphysics in like the more strict philosophical sense, but then also in the more sort of like ooey gooey woo sense,
Right.
I will look at all of it, I'll read absolutely everything. And I'm also a bit of a culture vulture. Like I will take all of it in, everything I possibly can. To me, every single sophisticated system, if it doesn't have a really deep recognition of the darkness, it's lacking. Like it can't be the sophisticated system if it doesn't engage the darkness. I think we're just seeing that now like play out on the world stage in a pretty big way.
Well, I was going to say we can't be beautiful souls, right? In the Hegelian sense, because that's this notion that everything's going to work out in the end. All the contradictions will smooth out, and somehow the dark energies will always bubble to the surface as rainbows and puppy dogs or something
Yeah.
like this, right? I
Yeah.
do think that that's interesting, that you do need some of that preliminary tension. Otherwise, I mean, well, it's kind of boring, right? I mean, I forget who says it about Milton. Was it Shelley who talked about Milton? You know, it's always boring when you're reading the parts about God and Jesus, but it's Satan who's the real if anti-hero, the real protagonist, the real interesting dynamic force in Paradise Lost. There is something sexy about those dark forces, whether or not on an everyday level we might want to forget that, but
I have to be careful about what I engage. You know, I do know that strange things happen when I'm writing in this sort of trance state. And I had a near-death experience. And so I've been reading a lot about near-death experiences recently. And I don't know if you know, the University of Virginia, they have this division of perceptual studies. There's this, like, at this point, fairly developed branch of, I guess you call it parapsychology. They do all this research on near-death experiences and reincarnation experiences, stuff that if you would have asked me 10 years ago if any of this is possible or real, I would have said, like, oh my God, like, get out of my face. Like, this is so stupid. Don't even ask me that, you know? But then, you know, when you have a near-death experience, things do change. But you know, when I read or listen to people talk about what happens in a near-death experience, and the language for everyone is pretty different, but there's this sort of general sense of, like, oh, the soul leaves the body and then it, you know, goes into this realm where it's just sort of floating in the oneness. And it's nothing but peace, just like the deepest sense of peace and pervading, absolutely perfect love and harmony. And, you know, when people have near death experiences, they often report feeling like this sort of zone or this, like, realm where they're just floating in the oneness is home. They call it home. It feels like home. And then when they're told, sorry, it's not your time yet, you actually have to go back into the body, it can be really depressing, because life on earth is obviously not floating in the oneness. And, you know, I'm not going to make any claims about whether or not any of that is true or false. I simply do not know. It's well above my pay grade. But I think there's something to the fact that, like, we desire transcendence and we desire to sort of be above the pain, the struggle, the suffering, the strife, the darkness. But, you know, on the other hand, we need it. Like, that's what makes us human. That's what keeps us tethered to this earth. And it is like a beautiful interplay between light and dark. The Jungian, like, the brighter the light, the darker the shadow, or the bigger the shadow. There is no absence of shadow. There is no absence of darkness. You can turn the lights up all the way, but then there's a bigger shadow. You know, it's just not possible to get away from the darkness. And I find that wonderful. Fruitful.
It is. And what's interesting is what I brought up. The Leotard quote seems to take on new significance in this light. Again, not to pun, about how desire.
Killing it with the puns. It's so good.
Well, that one wasn't even as good. Let's just, but okay. How desire is about, sort of, on the one hand, I always read desire in terms of the Latin as, you know, coming from the stars, right? That there's some sort of transcendent dimension, which, well, we won't go into psychoanalysis and Deleuze and Guattari and all this stuff, because you already said you're tired of all the becoming without organs in the novel, which I thought was funny. I marked that.
Yeah, that might not have been me speaking. You know, I honestly don't know.
That's true, but he reads it as there's no message coming from the gods, right? That somehow, and so he kind of turns it around to me where, okay, I always read it as a kind of notion that it's from the gods or from the stars. And so there's this aspect of transcendence as though it's, but he kind of says, like, no, it's actually the prefix, DE prefix, instead of it coming from, it's a negative, right? So it's not from the stars, it's more imminent or something like this. And I don't know etymologically if that's correct or not, or if it's just as viable, right? So I like that. I like that reading.
I was fascinated by his reading of Desire and the Desiderare. You know, I'm not a Latin scholar, and so I don't know if his etymological work is sound or not. Even if it is, I know a lot of people who are like, well, it's so irresponsible to play with etymology and build, you know, concept around it. I don't think it's irresponsible, but I know
so
people
that's a Heidegger.
So strongly, right? I know. I was fascinated by that because I think I had been without knowing it, I had been looking for an understanding of desire that was less tied up with this, oh, gift from the gods type stuff. What if desire is our cope because the gods won't talk to us, or because we don't know how to receive their messages if they're trying to talk to us?
Right.
Like maybe we don't know how to listen, or we can't, be on their vibration or whatever. So we desire because we feel that absence or something.
That solitude, that's the word you use throughout the work,
Mm.
I think. This notion of being alone, being solitary. This will be my one reference to Laruelle, which he kind of,
Mm.
for Laruelle, solitude, radical solitude is, kind of this imminent experience. It is the one, right?
Yeah.
Proper
Yep.
to humans. So I think it's this relation of being foreclosed to thought, language, the world, etc. So it's this sort of radical imminence is what he would call
Yeah.
it now, I think. And
Yeah.
now that I got my Laruelle reference out of the way, I do think that that's perhaps this question of solitude throughout the work gives
Mm.
another dimension to this I, this impersonal I that is speaking to us. And do you want to say maybe something about this question, because you do kind of start with this paradox, as you say in the prologue. There's this paradox of I'm writing in this vantage of solitude, but I'm trying to reach out, reach through
Yeah.
you. Do you want to speak to that?
It's just one of the paradoxes of life that ends up showing up in writing for me. It shows up in lots of other ways, but when I was writing this book, it showed up through writing. Part of that is actually very literal. I have family, I have friends, I have a bunch of work. I have, I guess, what you could call like a somewhat busy life. But in order to write, I have to forcibly remove myself from my life, really separate myself out and say, no, like I'm actually not going to go to dinner with everybody. I'm sorry, I have to do this writing. And it is kind of an insane and ridiculous thing to do. Like, why would I be turning down these offers of friendship and kinship and love in order to sit alone in my room, curled up in the corner of my bedroom, writing? Like, what the hell is the matter with me? It's that solitude. It's that paradoxical condition of life that sometimes we have to remove ourselves from community in order to understand what community is, and in order to make it possible for us to actually reach for other people in a meaningful way. And I think of it like parenting is actually a really great metaphor for all of this too, because if I can never get space from my daughter, then I'm actually a much poorer parent for it, because then like we're just too caught up in each other's affects and our moods are too interdependent. And like I actually have to remove myself from the role of mother in order to see her as her own separate person and soul. Then I can actually more fully attend to her as someone who, the fact that she is my daughter is just one small facet of her life, that requires that kind of forcible solitude in order to do that and to get there. I really felt it come out as I was writing this book, just like, yeah, sometimes in order to reach for people, I have to be really far away from them and I have to be at this remove. But I've come to understand that that's part of how I can actually be a more ethical actor in the world. I need a certain amount of distance in order to be able to say, okay, I'm not just a neighbor, I'm not just a friend, I'm not just a lover, I'm not just a parent, I'm not just a whatever. I am also this totally impersonal person. Knowing all of that, like separating, sort of, I guess you could say, floating out in the oneness. I can see it all from a remove, and I can more carefully ask myself, what do I actually need to do here? Like, what is this situation requiring of me? And then I can sort of re-enter the fray. But it is kind of tempting to just stay out there where there isn't any real responsibility and it's only theoretical. But I do have to get there, to that place of solitude. So I think that's maybe a more practical and literal, less theoretical answer. But that's how it was really coming out in this book.
I think that's wonderful. And I lied, I guess. I would just say that this is what Laruelle calls separated without separation. It's the separated that determines separation in the last instance. It's prior. It's like prior without any sort of relation of priority, blah, blah, blah. That starts to get mystical too. Sometimes when you really delve into Laruelle stuff, you get kernels of that mysticism. So
you do.
I would suggest, perhaps not speaking for you, but just my surmise would be maybe that's one thing that you would have found in Laruelle that you would have enjoyed. I don't know if it was just a happenstance thing translating him, but that can be for another conversation if you want, or you can address it here, because I do think it's fascinating, right? That you've got the philosophy PhD, but you're doing this highly creative work, the novelistic work, which is not typical for, well, who knows what's typical anymore for humanities PhDs, but also translating. So you do have this other side that, one of the reasons why I like translating is I can still have one foot in academia without necessarily having to go that route, right? I still feel like I'm participating in a chorus of scholarly voices. I'm not sure if you vibe with that type of outlook.
What do I vibe with? Well, to answer your first question, the reason I found Laruelle is because, I studied Bataille so much. I wrote my dissertation on non-knowledge, and and, once I was done with that, no, I actually probably read some Laruelle while I was doing my dissertation. I was digging around in the corners of philosophy that are kind of actively anti-philosophy.
Right.
So obviously I found my way to Laruelle, and I don't even remember what it was that grabbed me about Laruelle. Maybe even just the phrase non-philosophy was enough to pull me in. But as for my sort of scholarly involvement, or sometimes lack thereof, I went into the PhD knowing that it was not likely that I was ever going to find a tenure track job or sort of live that beautiful academic life. And I saw that as not a problem. Like, it's not a problem that I'm not a tenure track professor, it's not. And I knew that I had to go into the PhD accepting that as a reality and just saying, what can I learn? How can I use this time to get a free PhD? They fund you. How can I use this time to get a free PhD? And I'll figure out the future when the future comes, but how can I just immerse myself as fully as possible? And I think I just knew that was going to be necessary, because at that point, the writing was definitely on the wall about the lack of jobs. But I will say that when I started the program, I was one of the only people who was actually willing to articulate it and to say it out loud. And I ended up getting myself into trouble socially without really knowing I was doing that, by saying like, oh, well, none of us are going to have tenure track jobs, so I'm just here to learn. I remember people being like, well, then you should give up your spot to someone who wants to become a professional philosopher, because you're taking someone else's spot, someone who wants to go for that tenure track dream,
And you say, no, fuck you. You give up your spot, right? Like,
no, I mean, it's funny. Graduate school is it's a funny place. And a lot of people are in a, sort of funny moment in their lives. Most people, they've never hardcore worked, by the time I started the PhD, I had not even just a 9 to 5, but teaching, like a 7 to 7 basically. And so I'm not saying that I was more mature, because that's definitely not true. But I just had, I think, a more
different experiences.
A more realistic sense of what it's like outside academia. And so I've never feared being outside academia, same as I didn't go get an MFA and I didn't study at Columbia or anything, or Iowa or any of those programs. In a way, I don't really fear not being inside the literary establishment, because, well, I mean, why? I'll go wherever, I'm going to keep doing my work no matter what. And I'm going to keep connecting with people, because that's what I do, because I actually love connecting with other humans. And so I'm not too concerned about that. But, when I started the PhD, I don't know. I was moving by intuition. I think I work from intuition much, much more than I've ever really been willing to say out loud. It's all completely intuitive for me, I think. And What Are You was, I think, by far the most radical experiment for me in creating from intuition and using intuition as one method. There's many methods I used for this book, but intuition was one method for sure. And I pushed it farther than I've ever pushed it before.
I think it's interesting, right, though, that, as a philosopher, I'm just thinking about Kant says something right about how intuitions without concepts are blind, but concepts without intuition is empty. So you do have a nice marriage of them, but without necessarily imposing the concept as the determinative of, doesn't necessarily get the last word, right? There's a sense in which, as you're pointing out, the intuition kind of guides you. And I do like that you just said, like, I like engaging with people, because that gives a new flavor to the solitude, that in fact, going into the solitude, even if you are foregoing the opportunities of conviviality or whatever you want to call it, that, however, redounds and kind of intensifies that lived experience of co-belonging with others in the end.
Yeah.
So it is a kind of give and take, ebb and flow. Go back
Yes.
to that water metaphor, right? And
Mhm.
I think we can find that's very what's the word I'm trying to say? It's something I think we can all feel like we share in at some points. That giving and taking, or whether we want to call it the reality principle or not, because it's not just about deferred pleasure or anything like that. It
No.
really is about this
Mm-mm.
intensification, I think, that you bring up as what sort of art can mean in its relation to life, without it being about imitating life or anything like that, because I do think that gets us into a false dynamic of what's real and
Yes.
what's fake or something, but about
Yeah.
this intensification, which I really appreciated. The cold open did bring up this question of art and non-art, and you're like, whatever the fuck that really is in the
Yeah.
end. But to a certain extent, then bringing it full circle back to sort of art being an intensification of life, and
Yeah.
perhaps vice versa, makes it more of a, even if we aren't practicing artists or novelists, to a certain extent, there is this dynamic that it can't be separated off into these neat categories as though they're not
Yes.
coalescing, right?
Yes. And that is my great trouble often with talking about the things that I've created, especially, in the literary world, where you really have to, you're not just working with concept. You have to have a really clear identity, and, the conceptual basis of the book has to be not just identified, but also already recognized as totally legible. Do you know what I
Hmm.
mean? Totally legible. It's all about legibility, because that's how make something that can be marketed and sold effectively. And so my great trouble is when people are like, all right, so just tell us what the book is about in 10 minutes or less. And I'm not
Hmm.
really one. I've learned to be able to talk about my work and myself over the past few years. I've come a long way, but I was so incapable of that before. The defending my dissertation was like one of the hardest days of my entire life, because it was
Hmm.
like, oh my God, like I already wrote this thing and you all signed off on it. Now I have to go through this performance, performing what I know and how I know it and why I know it. When the whole document, by the way, because it's like an experimental definition of non-knowledge, is all about the limits of that, and how at the heart of knowledge is the very absence of knowledge. Like, I've got to perform all this shit for you. Like, I
Yeah,
can't do
yeah,
it. And of course
yeah.
I did it, and it's fine. But I feel that same challenge each time I have to talk about my work. But I think it's actually really good that I am learning how to talk about it and that I'm doing it. I'm going to have to be okay with the fact, or accept the fact, that I can't talk about my work the way other people talk about their work. And I'm often jealous of how they can talk about their work and how their work can be sold. And I know that the fact that my work is what it is and I am who I am can make me seem aloof or standoffish, or, just like clueless when it comes to the marketing aspect of all of it. But like, I just don't know what other way to do it. I didn't set out saying like I will become an artist. I was just like, well, I
Right.
think I have a book. What do I do with it? Okay, I think I have another book. What do I do with it? Okay, now I think I have this thing. What do I do with it? It is my life, and it unfolds within my life and within the world, and
Hmm.
the broader world, the larger world. There is no separating art and not art, life and not life. It's all, what does Joni Mitchell say? Nothing is capsulized in me.
I think you're right, though. There's a sense in which everything can be material. So it does then come down to being able to filter and sieve out the choice nuggets, if you will.
Yeah.
And I do think that question of sort of what's your work about, as you've seen what we've been kind of swimming through, if you will, right? What we've
Yeah.
been kind of groping towards is less about like what it is about than sort of what it's doing, right? I think that's part of that's one of the fundamental things, one of the first things I feel like I learned from Deleuze and Guattari, right? It's about like, don't ask what the book means. That's really a surface level thing. Ask sort of like, what is it doing? What does it do when it's brought in conjunction with other machines, other
Yes.
books, right? Like,
Yes.
what is the impact that can be? I think even they get this though. If I remember, I think Guattari even admits like he kind of gets this from Proust. That Proust, the one who's
Mm,
kind of like,
yeah.
hey, if the book works and it does something for you, great. If not, then find something that does, right? I think that's when we write or feel like we have something to share. It is not necessarily meant for everyone or even a general every man, but it's,
Yeah.
you still put yourself out there, you make yourself vulnerable, and you hope that there is some kind of I suppose.
You just cut out, so I didn't hear that very last word.
Oh, you just hope there's some kind of resonance, right?
Resonance.
You know, like
Resonance.
to go back to the back of your book, which mentions this love affair with the cosmos or something like this. You put something back out into the cosmos and hope for that, perhaps that ripple effect, if you will, that can bring, you're throwing something out, but hopefully something is coming back in. I know you even play with this notion of capacities of giving and receiving, and perhaps not being able to receive, or perhaps what we can give is limited by what we can receive or are unwilling to receive.
Definitely. That's completely related. It simply couldn't be related. Your earlier point about like, there are more interesting questions to ask of a book than like, well, how would you describe this? I mean, to me, the
Right.
most important question to ask is like, what comes of this? You know, what practices come of this? Particularly with a book that is about, I think so far all my books are very generally about possibilities of intimacy and communication, and what that could mean personally, politically, in small ways and big ways, micro, macro, you know, all of that. So to me, a really important question to ask of my books is like, what practices could come of this? Because as much as I have Bataille's concerns about utility and life being driven by utility within me, I also do know that books have often been some of my best friends, and they have shown me how to live. And not just books, all art. Art has taught me how to live so much. So much. So if my books aren't capable of teaching other people how to live, then I don't know that they should be taking up paper. I don't know that they're better than trees, you know?
Right.
The trees should stay standing, probably. What was the second part of your thought? It was
Oh,
about,
just
giving and
that.
receiving.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. This is just one of the harder truths of life, I think, you know, that it's akin to like you will see whatever you want to see everywhere you look. You know, if you are certain that everyone is hateful and terrible, you really will see that. You know, you'll see
Right.
an abundance of evidence. But if you, on the other hand, if you're convinced that everyone is just wonderful and loving and there's nothing but beautiful souls out there, you will also see that. You definitely won't be getting the full picture, but you will see that. It's the same as like, you can only receive as much as you're willing to give, and you can only give as much as you're willing to receive. And that's very hard to determine. It sounds nice and simple and easy, but it's very, very hard to determine. And so often when it comes to human relationships, we're so clouded by longing, and I don't even necessarily mean like erotic longing or sexual longing, because erotic and sexual are two different things to me. But, you know, perception is clouded by longing, and that's not a bad thing. But if we can't recognize that, then we're in a sort of, I don't know, half asleep state, I think. And so it's just really hard to determine how much can be given and received when we have this longing desire, and it's attachment. You know, you could think about Buddhist attachment and like the practice of non-attachment just being a sort of an attempt to separate yourself from your desires long enough to see that you're in fact being clouded. Your vision and your perception is clouded by the longing, the desires, the attachment. I think I'll never stop having things to say about that, probably.
It's interesting because I do think one of the things that I really enjoyed, again, towards the end, was this notion, because we were talking about dark forces, and I mentioned earlier, it is about some of what you're doing, plumbing the depths, is trying to get to those forces beyond the personal or personality. And you say, I'm coming face to face with as many as I can, the forces. And then you say there's something bright in the darkness. The thing I underlined and like scribbled around was, but the results hardly matter once you get started. It's the dice throw. It's not good because you might win. It's necessary because no matter the results you've thrown, you've risked, it's its own reward. Once you start throwing, you can start living. I like that notion that even if we are confronting or acknowledging the dark forces, even if we may talk about, as you just did, questions of desire and detachment, there is still this notion of risking and putting oneself out there or putting out there at all, and
Yes.
being willing to, in a very kind of Deleuzian way, I was thinking about sort of the ideal game of the dice throw, where it is about winning. It is about this affirmation of eternal return, et cetera, et cetera. I don't mean to always bring in this stuff, but I felt like
that's fine. No, I love it. I've spent a lot of time in that world. I do love it. It made its way into my book, very obviously, right? Because it's in there.
I think one of the last things I wanted to bring up, because I do want to hear about maybe what you are working on now or what you have planned for the future. And again, don't necessarily need to belabor the point, because I do think the audience should go out, get a copy of your book and read, because the experience itself, what we're doing, talking about some of the theoretical resonances, doesn't do justice to actually the experiencing it.
Thank you.
Well, of course. I mean, I was blown away, and it was a slow roll. It's kind of like a snowball effect, I feel like, reading the book, because you're jumping in to the unknown, and there is a little bit of white noise, I think, kind of like at the beginning of an album, to ward off casual listeners. But once you get your feet wet, let's say, then you can be borne along by the waves. There's this notion, and I could be wrong, and this could be me reading into it, which you can't blame me for, I suppose. But there seems to be, obviously we talked about the dark forces, and there's this theme of, I don't want to say theme, there is this literal evocation of death, of quote unquote you dying, that you bring up, which I'm not going to ask you to personally here, but you have, what I was thinking about was, there is a tension between mourning, again, quote unquote, your death, whatever you that may be, and also part of the tension in that mourning is this celebration of an or the apocalypse, right? So I read it as an exaltation and kind of what you call the more, and perhaps a celebration of a cessation of, whether it be suffering, attachment, enoughness, which is why I think that refrain of "Are you ready to suffer?" is perhaps so strong. So I guess I wanted to ask you a little bit. I know that's such a huge thing. Hey, can you talk about death and the apocalypse? But
that's cool. Yeah.
Am I kind of in the ballpark about that? This tension of mourning, of the passing away, and yet celebrating this apocalypse, as you sometimes call it.
I mean, there is no correct or incorrect reading of this book. Do you know what I mean? And of all books, I don't believe that there's a correct reading or an incorrect reading, and there is no magical key that unlocks it. I very seriously want everything I write to be experiential. And I want the people who open my books to have an experience with them. And that is beyond my control. And I really accept that. It's not easy to accept, but I really accept it. And that means that I get strong reactions, typically, like really strongly positive reactions or really strongly negative reactions.
Right.
Like the sheer number of emails I've gotten from people that begin with "what the fuck." It's hilarious.
That could be the title of your next book. What the fuck?
What the fuck? I am death obsessed, of course. I'm a living person. I'm death obsessed, but I mean, in a positive sense too, right? I have Nietzsche flowing through my veins in lots of ways. And part of this book is part of the practice of assenting to life up unto death, laughing in the face of death, accepting death as the beautiful mystery that it will be, and not welcoming it, having to learn the balance between too eagerly edging toward it, the way that an impulsive and reckless teenager would. Not saying that I did that, although in some ways I did.
Right.
In some ways I kind of always will, but I'm extra thoughtful and careful now because people depend on me,
Right.
But why not be reckless and waste life, because that is a celebration of life in a way. But we are living in a moment where I have to be extremely careful. We all have to be extremely careful about how we engage those drives within us, how we engage those impulses to get all the way up to the edge of death. And I believe we do have, I don't want to call it the death drive, because Freud, I think, left a lot out of the picture of what makes a human. I do think we have this need. The very surface version of it is that we like to look at things we're not sure we should be looking at, or we like to get excited by things we're not so sure we should get excited by, and that's what's sexy and that's what's fun. And that's why Elvis was who Elvis was, right? Everybody was like, oh no, he's swiveling his hips. We're not supposed to like this, but we really like this. Yeah, exactly. But that's connected to me to the fact that we desire to get close to death. And I don't think that's something to be afraid of. That's, I guess you could call that darkness. And I'm not a goth, but of course I am a goth, right?
Right.
Yeah. So you go ahead.
No, you describe it as you have this point where you bring up Anais, whom was a literary scholar and thinker, I think, that you kind of
A
cite.
nice nin. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Anais Nin. Yeah, right. I've read some of her stuff on Hawthorne, but I don't know her rest of her work. But you bring her up talking about this question of becoming equal to life, and you turn it around, like make me equal to death, right? Is kind of what you say. I don't want what you want, make me equal to death, which I think maybe is the Bataille coming back through, right?
Right.
Like, but perhaps that's part of what you're talking about, is this becoming equal to death, because again, my Deleuze perks up, when Deleuze talks about becoming equal to the event, perhaps he's not necessarily talking about becoming equal to life, which seems to be, again, the Nietzschean thing where it's like, we're part and parcel of life, we're judge and jury. How can we necessarily judge becoming equal to life? But becoming equal to death does seem to hold up this question of not to be unworthy of what happens to us, right? It gets kind of back to that risking. So yeah, that was the thing that I immediately thought of when you were answering that. I had some parts that I've marked up nicely, very lovingly in your book.
Do what you will with it, right?
That, like, use it. That's what I was. I was trying to use it and soak it in. Sucking up the marrow of life or whatever. I was sucking in your work and trying to grapple with it. Right. It's it is something that deserves that attention, and there's obviously a lot more I could bring up in terms of kind of grappling with some of the big themes and some of the moments and some of your quotes. And as you had that great cold open, which the listeners already heard, I just think I really feel good perhaps where we're at now. I wanted to give you the chance to maybe tell us a little bit about what you're working on, or if you're crafting a new novel or a set of novels, who knows, and also be sure to plug your translation for the theory nerds that are listening.
First, just thank you for all of that. It's really great to be taken up in such a thoughtful way. That is ultimately the dream of anyone who writes a book, I think. I don't want fans. I know that we're supposed to gather fans. I don't want fans. On the one hand, like that's, fanatic, because it's not a good thing. I don't want people who are fanatical. I don't want fans. I want engagement. Yeah. And I have to be very honest about that, and there's only so much attention I can give. And there's also only so much attention I can receive. But,
right. There you go.
I wouldn't bother publishing if I weren't hoping that the things that are grappled with in the text can also be grappled with in the minds and hearts and souls of the people who open the books. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for it. It means everything, really. And what am I working on now? I'm working on a bunch of things. My life is in flux right now because I'm about to move overseas, which is great. But it also means having to learn a new language, which means having to learn a new way to live, obviously. So I've been working on this novel for a few years. The idea for it came to me when I still was looking for a publisher for my first book, From Nowhere. Yeah, and I was finishing up the translation at that point too. So it was a very different point in my life. But this idea for this novel came to me in a dream, and it's the first time when an idea has come to me as more of an idea. Typically what happens is like I have characters who like set up shop within me, and then I start sort of, letting them talk through me, I guess. And, it really does feel like possession most of the time. And I can hold it off when I'm not writing them. When it's time, it's time, It's like a Linda Blair moment. This other novel I've been writing, it's interesting to me because I think one of the characters is not a human and is in fact a force, which I don't know if I want to bother writing a force, but this is just what's happening. Who knows? It might be changed dramatically by the time it's hopefully published. But as of now, one of the characters is a non-human force. And it has to do with space capitalism and space travel and civilization and society and psychics and physics. So I've been doing so much fascinating research, spending a lot of time talking to people who are psychics, a lot of time talking to people who are physicists. So it's incredible. Like you get into this zone where one day I'm talking to a psychic and the next day I'm talking to someone who specializes in black holes. And I swear they are so often speaking the same language. And so my head is in a funny place, a really wonderful place, but a pretty funny place right now. It's going very slowly because I don't have a ton of time to give it. I think I'm really excited about it. And I hope that it turns into something. I hope that I can turn it into something. What else? I've got a couple short stories that are out on submission. I hope those find a place to get published soon. God, I really like short stories. I find that when I write a short story, I give myself permission to just be totally wicked. So I've got some short stories out there. I'm also working on a philosophy manuscript. I'm taking a lot of my philosophical work on Bataille's concept of non-knowledge, and I'm reworking it. I felt like I've stripped it down to its core, and now I'm seeing, what do I really want to do with this? Because I love the work that I've done on it. I really do. And I think that non-knowledge is a great concept. Sounds so cheesy, but like it's such a juicy concept. There's so much happening there. And it's totally anti-concept and a-conceptual in so many ways. So it gives me another opportunity to like exist in the space of infinite paradox, which I guess I just love. I guess that's my zone, for now anyway.
Right.
So there's those things I'm working on, and I'm going to be teaching some courses here and there too, because I do really like teaching, and it's just a great way to connect with people, to stay sharp, to stay on my toes, and a way to make a bit of money on the side, even though it's not primarily a money-making thing for me. So I'm going to be teaching for the New Center in the summer. I'm going to be doing my own thing in the next couple of months, I'm trying to make theory very accessible and open to people who are interested. So we're going to be doing a little bit of Bataille, working with Bataille, thinking about intimacy and religion and violence and destruction and death and all that stuff.
And expenditure and all that, right?
Yes, of course. Yeah, expenditure is the overarching framework, I guess. When I say it all like that, it sounds like nothing, but it's a really productive, knock on wood, it's a really productive time in my life. And I feel like I'm just getting started as a creator and as a thinker. So I think I have to hang on tight and like remember my roots and be really focused, but also still give myself permission to be wild and free. Because one thing I've noticed with people who like they put out a book or two and there's more attention paid to them is that I think I see them getting scared.
Discouraged? Yeah.
And I totally understand that, because it is scary. It's scary. Your first negative review is hard and scary. And, the first set of dick pics and death threats, that's hard and scary. And there's been times when I've thought like, that's it. I'm never publishing anything again. Like, fuck it. It's not worth it. I don't care. But it doesn't matter whether or not I publish. What matters is that I keep having a living relationship with all this stuff that I'm doing. So that I will look after, like with fierce gentleness.
I like all of those things. I am excited about the translation coming out, which you didn't plug, which I'm going to plug again for you.
Please, yes, do it.
That's coming out this month. Obviously, I'm really glad that you're also going to be workshopping your Bataille piece, because I think that's a whole realm that we really didn't. We kind of like skirted around it, but that could be that's its own like podcast episode. So that could be something in the future. Obviously, when you're working through that and that feels like it's at a good place, that would be something to come back to talk about, because getting to talk about these things, not just the artistic stuff, but the theoretical, and not necessarily trying to make a hard divide, made this conversation for me really enjoyable. And I will say for Coop, because I know he's been listening.
What are you up to over there?
The space capitalism. Do you want to talk about? You want to talk?
He anticipated.
All right, I'm gonna let him have the last word.
Do it.
Your novel sounds awesome, but it reminds me very much of Dune. So I had to sneak the reference in there before the episode was out. So I'm wanting to like write some crazy schizo screed on more of a like philosophical piece than anything on like Dune. So thinking about time and prescient visions and kind of the same. This is kind of where my head's at all the time, because I'm like obsessing with this stuff. And then Deleuze and Guattari and Laruelle and etc. just open up even more space and whatnot. So looking forward to that coming out for sure.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we'll see. I don't know what it is. Like everything I do, I don't know what it is when I start, and then,
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah,
eventually.
I like that. Let it. What is it? A gardener as opposed to an architect, or I forget that distinction. Let things grow and see where they go.
And the thing about gardening too, this was like a huge metaphor for me while I was working on What Are You? Because I was beginning to like garden in a more serious way. Everything starts growing in the dark. A seed grows in the dark. It does not, and it reaches for the light eventually. But
right, nice. That's good. That's really good.
That's the Schellingian aspect of your work, the appreciating the darkness. So, Lindsay, I really do appreciate you sharing your time with us, talking about your work and beyond and underneath and on the other side of. So again, we just thank you for coming and talking about your work, which is, well, first you got two works, obviously. I'm From Nowhere and What Are You, which I forget the press, but you can find it on Amazon or A Books or wherever you like to get your books, I'm sure.
Yes.
And I recommend it highly. And
we'll put links in the show notes, of course.
Yeah, definitely put links in the show notes. And as I said, once you've, maybe later in the year, maybe this time next year, we'll have you back and we can do some more of talking about life, existence, and the universe and everything, all that.
Yeah,
darkness and death.
Darkness and death. Yeah, this is
Destruction.
the goth happy hour. The machine.
Exactly. Right.
Machine
I'm kind of gothy, so
the machine of
goth
happy
space
hour.
wizardry.
Right.
Yes.
Yes. We'll let you go and enjoy the rest of your weekend. We'll be in touch, obviously, and this episode will probably drop next week.
Thank you so much, guys. This was a total delight.
Excellent.
Thank you to Lindsay Lerman, and that will wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins.
The very roots of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious. The whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.